Today there was a lot to see and do. First up was the Grand Canyon, then Monument Valley, then Mexican Hat, and I was going to leave it to a game time decision whether natural bridges would be the end of today or the first thing tomorrow. Last night the bartender told me a good place for breakfast, so I headed back into downtown Flagstaff, and right across from the Beaver Street Brewery there was Macy's. Putting around town looking for a place to park, and as I roll by this guy yells out, "Triumph!" Saw him and waved. I found a place to park and went inside the Macy's, and while I was waiting in line, it was a counter type of a place, the guy came in and got in line behind me. Told me he had a Triumph back in the 60s. And I asked him, well, what year, what model? He sort of shut down. I was thinking, that was kind of a weird way to end the conversation, but apparently we're done talking. Actually, that was fine with me. I realized I don't really know much about the early years of Triumph, so I was just being polite, wouldn't really have much to add to the conversation anyways. I figured we were done talking, and I almost turned around to kind of just be back in line as opposed to talking to this guy, and he said to me, "I went to see the Grateful Dead 2 nights ago." I'm thinking that he doesn't even remember the question I asked him. And then he said, "You understand I might not remember things that happened in the 60s? Okay, well, that was weird. I got my egg sandwich in Danish and enjoyed sitting at the breakfast bar looking out the window watching the morning commute, which in Flagstaff apparently is a bunch of hipsters riding fixies. Just one after the other, fixie bike going down the street. I headed just out of town on Route 66, grabbed some gas, got a picture of my bike next to the Route 66 sign, just a regular sign, nothing special, and got on I-40 heading back west. As I was going along the boring slab, I zoomed in on the GPS and noticed that I-80 looked to be going about the same direction I was headed, but a little more squiggly, and being a back road, I was a little upset that I hadn't chosen it. Then again, this portion of the trip was sort of thrown together, kind of visit a bunch of national parks was really the only directive, instead of the micromanagement planning that I usually do. Heading north to the Grand Canyon entrance off of I-40, I fell in line with a long line of cars and RVs and trailers doing just about the speed limit. It was a long line and there was really no good way to pass, so I just settled in and tried to enjoy the ride in a straight line, nice and slow. At one point I noticed another motorcycle pull up behind me, and from what I could tell in my mirror, something looked strange. Eventually he passed me and started making his way up the line. After he passed me, I was able to confirm he was riding with one foot up on the tank, which is kind of what I thought when I saw him in my mirror, but I couldn't be sure. He had California plates and he wasn't going fully into the other lane, he was just sort of lane splitting, even though there weren't 2 lanes going the same direction. Finally I was to the entrance of Grand Canyon National Park, and I pulled over to get my picture with the sign. Unlike Zion, this sign was not right next to the roadway, and from the parking lot there were a bunch of sidewalk and park benches and other things between me and the sign. It was obvious you weren't supposed to drive there. Much like Zion, I didn't want my picture in front of the sign, I wanted me and the bike in front of the sign. So it took a bit of waiting and then a lot of pushing the bike on the sidewalk, but I got there, got my picture. Once in the park, I was surprised by how much road there was before you got to any of the tourist places. Eventually I got to the main parking lot and headed to the Mather Overlook. Now, you might notice that this cockpit footage isn't all that compelling. Apparently I had forgotten I was recording, so I got a bunch of boring road footage, and then worse. I spent about an hour browsing the well-attended south rim at the Mather Overlook, and I captured this captivating video. I'd been here before when I was in high school and on a summer vacation with the family, and because of that experience I almost didn't bother stopping here, but figured I was too close to pass it up. I'm glad I stopped because it was actually quite a bit better than I remember. Perhaps the perspective of a few years later, or because I got myself here on my bike, or I don't know, but I did spend a lot more time here than anticipated, all the while gathering data on the parking lot. You can see my security system, which is I threw my jacket over the GPS and the GoPro so I didn't have to worry about them getting stolen. I wasn't prepared for how much distance there were between the Grand Canyon and Monument Valley. On the map they looked like they were right next to each other, The skies were threatening, so I suited up and eventually it got rained on before I finally pulled into the entrance to Monument Valley. Here I see the sign is right next to the road and nobody is around. I think to myself, awesome, I don't have to play the waiting game and I don't have to figure out how to get the bike over there. But as I pull off the pavement, I notice that a lot of people pull off the pavement here, and there's a pretty significant drop off to the sand. Well, it was a bit hairy, real soft sand, but I got up next to the sign without too much trouble. It seemed like I was fortuitous because as I was getting my kickstand plate, I noticed I was parked right over top of a rock that looked like it would do the job. So I put the side stand down, set it on the rock, gingerly stepped off, and everything held. I got my picture and then jumped on the bike to head on out of there. It was on a slight lean and I picked up the bike but didn't get it full up. No big deal, I've done this several times where it kind of failed to upright it the first time. So I set it back down to try again. Well, setting it back down, it either missed the rock or the rock had moved or something because it just right over on its side. Thankfully there was another visitor that came by to get their photo with the sign and they rushed over to help. Now I had seen the old lady picking up a Goldwing method. I knew the technique, so part of me was thinking, I got this, I don't need any help. They helped, but I wasn't quite sure how much they actually helped because it was really easy and I was doing the old lady technique. Another trip that I don't want to really talk about, I happened to drop it again and I was by myself, and let me tell you, I know those guys helped a lot because I was fully loaded on this trip, and when I dropped it later, not fully loaded, I could barely get it back up. So thank you to whoever that was that stopped and helped me out. I headed into Monument Valley and the skies were still threatening, so I left the suit on and went into the visitor center. While walking around, sweating my butt off in that vinyl suit, the skies turned nice again, so I dropped the suit, went back into the parking lot to see if I would do this scenic drive. In the parking lot, I had run into another bike, a 1980s KZ1000, and they had Michigan plates. Just happened to run into them as I was getting back to my bike, and they were a couple from Whitehall, which is only about 50 miles from here. They had trailered to Colorado and they were riding around the national park, so we chatted for a little bit and I shared my recent tip-over story and kind of got a giggle out of it. I wasn't quite ready to laugh about it yet. Then headed on to the scenic drive. Now the scenic drive was claimed to be rough and they recommended a 4x4, but I was here, I just dropped the bike, I overcame that, so I went for it. I set up the GoPro and here I was surprised to see it wouldn't turn on. It wouldn't be until I got back home I realized I had captured all that footage of the Grand Canyon parking lot. So there was a couple of cool places that I stopped and grabbed some cockpit photos with the iPhone. I didn't want to put the kickstand down and step off given my recent tip over, so I didn't get as many cool shots as I wanted. And there was one time, it was really cool, one of the native boys was running his horse out of his driveway and onto the main drag here. He was at a full gallop, a couple cars ahead of me, then he slowed down to a slow trot and a couple of the cars passed him and the horse had no problem. When I got up kind of close to the horse, you could see the horse was getting agitated and kind of looking around trying to figure out what was going on. The boy looked back, saw me, and took off in a full trot, gallop, I don't know horse language, just tearing out of there. It was really cool to see. Well, they got to a spot where he could stop the horse and turn him around and watch me pass, and you could still see the horse was kind of bucking and not so happy that I was getting close to him, but he was under control from his rider, so passed on by, gave the guy a nod, and I wish I had that on GoPro. So back on the road, next up was Mexican Hat. I went through the town of Mexican Hat, but I saw no sign for the national park. I turned around because I figured I must have missed it, and the road that came down into the little village was pretty cool, right along the river there, so I didn't mind running it again. Still didn't see any signs, so I gave up on visiting Mexican Hat and, well, let's do natural bridges then, I've got time. Along the way I started noticing an interesting rock formation off on the side, and I thought I recognized it from pictures. Like, hey, is that Mexican Hat? Saw a couple spots where people could pull over from the main road, but no signs or anything. But eventually I did see a sign for Mexican Hat. Pulled off on this little two-track that kind of dead-ended in a gravel parking lot. There was one other car there, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. It kind of looked like there was a mom and her 12-year-old kid, but they were both smoking, and the kid was kind of trying to hide it. I just gave him a little nod, took a quick pic of the bike, the good side, and moved along. So coming this way, it made more sense to follow 261, even though I had read online it was a steep gravel grade, unimproved, 4x4 recommended, but I was well past worrying about these things, so I went for it. So here I was approaching this huge bluff straight ahead of me on 261. There was just a rock wall going on and on forever, and it was really tall. I couldn't see where the road went. There were several signs warning about the road being unpaved, steep, switchbacks, no guardrails. You couldn't tell where the road went. I guess no guardrails. Yeah, you're not going to see the road up there. Suddenly I was at the base of the rock and I started climbing. It was awesome. And again, here's some footage from that. Into Natural Bridges National Park, the sun was low in the sky and it made a tough time for getting my sign photo. I did my due diligence and documented that part of the visit. Then inside the park, the road was narrow, one lane only, one way, and winding. It was posted at like 15 miles an hour or something. It was a lot of fun, even at 30 miles an hour. There was nobody around. I think I saw about 3 cars the entire time I was here. Unfortunately, that low sun was making it difficult to see any of the attractions, and even harder to photograph any of them because each vista was looking west, right into the sun, and then the bridges themselves were already in the shadows. I stopped a few places, read a few signs, tried to get a couple of pictures, but eventually I was back at the entrance, and I decided I'd do that little loop once more and get some cool footage on the GoPro. Oh, yeah. Setting out from the park, the sun was setting. There were some awesome sights along the back roads. I pulled into Blanding and checked into my hotel. It was about 8 o'clock. I picked one of the 2 places for dinner, but I got there and it was after 8 and they were closed. There were plenty of people in the place, but they weren't taking any new customers, so I went to the other place in town. It looked like that place had closed years ago. So I decided, well, I guess Subway, that was right next to my motel room, that'd be fine. So I went to the gas station next door to this place and figured I'd grab some brews for my Subway. But there weren't any brews. I remembered going past a big gas station on the other side of town, so I headed over there. I knew within this gas station there was an A&W, and it was already closed due to the obscenely late hour. And there was a bowling alley. I'm not sure if that bowling alley was operational, but I know there wasn't any beer. So I had a dry dinner, which was extra sad because it was just a sub from Subway. In the hotel, I called and got an update from the wife about their day at Disneyland, and then got to bed early, knowing that tomorrow was another exciting sightseeing day.